Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ravencross, was not a man who smiled at letters. Most letters brought small problems. Tenants complaining about rents, cousins asking for loans, invitations he had no wish to accept. But this envelope was different. It arrived on a gray morning in London, sealed in black wax, the handwriting sharp and formal, as if the pen itself had been angry. The name on the front made his pulse tighten before he even touched it. Thorne. He broke the seal with a slow, steady hand. He had learned long ago that showing emotion was a weakness other men use against you. Still, as his eyes moved over the first line, a cold heat rose in his chest. Lord Edmund Thorne is dead. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he read again, just to be certain the words were real. Dead. The man who had haunted Sebastian's life like a shadow was finally gone. The letter continued in a careful tone, written by a solicitor in York. There were legal phrases, proper wording, tidy details meant to keep feeling out of business. But nothing could soften the central fact. Thornhill Manor and all the lands attached to it now belonged, by law, to Sebastian Ashford. It should have felt like victory. He had imagined this day for 15 years, sometimes in bright flashes, sometimes in dark, quiet hours when sleep would not come. He had pictured the Thorne crest pulled down from the gates, the Thorne name stripped from deeds and ledgers, the old enemy reduced to ink on a page. Yet as he stood by the window, the letter shaking slightly in his grip, he felt something sharper than triumph. He felt the old wound opening. The solicitor's letter did not end there. There was one more line, placed almost like an afterthought, but it struck harder than the announcement of death. There is, however, a complication. Miss Evangeline Thorne remains at the estate and refuses to vacate. Sebastian let out a short breath through his nose. Of course there was a complication. The Thornes had always been skilled at creating them. He walked to his desk and read the line again, slower. Miss Thorne, a daughter. He knew Edmund Thorne had married late, if he married at all. In the circle Sebastian moved in, people spoke of Edmund Thorne the way they spoke of storms on the coast. Dangerous, unavoidable, best observed from a distance. They spoke of his gambling, his pride, his temper, and the scandal that had once swallowed the Ashford name whole. Sebastian folded the letter once. Twice. He pressed it flat on the desk, as if pinning down a troublesome insect. Then he stared at the papers for a long moment, his mind moving backward, not to law or land, but to memory. He was 13 when his world cracked apart. Before the fall, House Ashford had been respectable, if not dazzling. Their name carried weight. Their word meant something. Sebastian's father, James Ashford, had been admired in the county and welcomed in the best drawing rooms. His mother had been proud, gentle, and deeply in love. Sebastian remembered summer evenings when laughter carried through the halls, when servants moved without fear, and when the future felt solid beneath his feet. Then came the whispers. A business matter, people said at first. An unfortunate misunderstanding with funds. Rumors of an overseas venture that had ended poorly. India was mentioned, always in vague terms, as if distance had blurred truth. There were meetings behind closed doors. Letters arrived and disappeared. His father's face grew tight, his voice sharp. Men arrived at the estate with hard eyes and official papers. And behind it all, the name Thorne began to appear like a stain that would not wash out. Lord Edmund Thorne, so the story went, had ruined James Ashford. He had accused him, betrayed him, and then used his connections to ensure no one listened to James's defense. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Sebastian had heard too many versions, too many half-told tales and hushed voices. But the end was always the same. The Ashford honor shattered. Creditors came. Friends turned away. Invitations stopped. The family's place in society weakened, then broke. Sebastian remembered his mother's decline more clearly than anything. Grief had not struck her like lightning. It had worked slowly, like a cold damp settling into stone. She stopped playing music. She stopped walking the gardens. She stopped eating at times, her eyes fixed on nothing, as if she were listening for a sound only she could hear. When Sebastian tried to speak to her, she would smile faintly, touch his cheek, and whisper that everything would be well. Nothing was well. His father, one strong, became a man who stared into fireplaces and drank too much brandy. Sebastian would see him holding letters with shaking hands, then burning them in silence. He never spoke of Edmund Thorne directly, but the hatred lived in the spaces between his words. It lived in the way he stiffened when a carriage passed on a road. It lived in the way he looked at his son, as if he regretted bringing a boy into a world that could do this to a family. Within 2 years, his mother was gone. Within another year, his father followed, worn down by disgrace, debt, and despair. People called it illness. People called it sorrow. Sebastian called it murder done slowly, without blood, and he blamed Edmund Thorne. 15 years. 15 years of carrying that name like a blade. 15 years of building himself into a man no one could bend, no one could ruin. He became Duke of Ravencross at 21 and made the title mean something again. He restored Ashford Holdings. He paid off what could be paid. He forced society to accept him through sheer strength and cold determination. But there was one thing he never released: the need to settle accounts. Now, at last, the law had placed Thornhill Manor in his hands. It felt less like a gift and more like fate finally turning its face toward him. Sebastian rang the bell. When his valet entered, Sebastian's voice was calm, practiced. "Pack for travel," he said. "We leave for Yorkshire within the hour." The valet hesitated, surprised. "Yorkshire, Your Grace?" "Yes." Sebastian slid the letter into a leather case as if it were a weapon he intended to carry close. Thornhill Manor. The valet's eyes flickered, just for a moment, showing he understood the weight of that name. Then he bowed and moved quickly, as trained servants did when they sense a storm behind their master's calm. Within the day, Sebastian's London house was left behind, along with Parliament matters and social obligations he could not bring himself to care about. He sent short, sharp messages to those who needed to know: his steward, his solicitor, a political ally who would complain about his absence. He ignored the rest. By afternoon, he sat in his carriage, the interior lined in dark green velvet, the crest of Ravencross stamped into the leather. 2 horses pulled steadily through the city streets, then onto the long roads north. Another carriage followed with trunks and a footman. The world outside shifted from stone and smoke to open fields and bare winter trees. The countryside should have soothed him. It did not. Every mile felt like a tightening cord. His thoughts returned again and again to that single phrase: "Miss Evangeline Thorne refuses to vacate." Refuses. The word suggested stubbornness. Pride. A Thorne trait, no doubt. He pictured her as a pale little creature clinging to a crumbling house, believing sentiment could stand against law. Yet he also knew the sort of man Edmund Thorne had been. A daughter raised under such a father would not be soft. She would be taught to fight, even if her weapons were words and looks instead of fists. Sebastian's jaw tightened. It changed nothing. She could refuse all she liked. He would claim what was his. Every brick, every acre. What he didn't know, what no letter had warned him, was that she held a secret that would destroy everything he believed. As days slipped toward evening, the carriage climbed into rougher country. The roads narrowed. Stone walls lined the lanes, and wind moved across the moors in long, lonely sweeps. Villages became fewer. The sky grew heavy and low, the color of pewter. Sebastian watched the landscape with steady gaze, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his father's face the last winter James Ashford lived, the shame that sat on him like a weight. He thought of his mother's hands, thin and cold. He thought of the name Thorne spoken like a curse. He told himself this was justice. He told himself he was only finishing what fate began. Near dusk on the second day, the land changed again. The fields looked tired, the fences poorly kept. A neglected orchard stood with crooked branches, unpruned and wild. A tenant's cottage leaned slightly, its roof patched in a way that suggested money had run out long ago. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. Thornhill lands, he realized, the first signs of the estate's health. Not impressive. The carriage rounded a bend, and Thornhill Manor came into view. It sat on a low rise, larger than Sebastian expected, but not grand in the way wealth announced itself. It was the kind of house that had once been proud. Stone walls, tall windows, a long drive lined with bare trees. Yet time and neglect had taken their toll. Ivy clung where it should have been cut back. The gates hung slightly uneven. A corner of the roof showed darker patches where rain had likely found its way in. Even from a distance, the place looked like a great creature that had grown old and was now waiting to die. Sebastian leaned forward slightly, studying it with the cold eye of a man used to evaluating value. The estate might be his by law, but it would not come without cost. And somewhere inside those walls was a last living Thorne, refusing to move. The horses slowed as they approached the drive. The crunch of gravel filled the quiet. A few figures appeared near the steps, servants, stiff-backed, watching as the carriage carried not a new owner, but an invading army. Sebastian did not look away. He sat still, gloved hands resting on his cane, his expression controlled. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing anything like excitement. He would give them only certainty. Then, just as the carriage rolled closer, a sound drifted out through the cold air. Piano music. Not loud, not showy. Something soft and haunting, like a memory played carefully so it would not break. The notes floated from an open window somewhere on the lower floor, rising and falling with the wind. Sebastian's breath caught, just slightly. It was unexpected. Thornhill looked like a house that had forgotten beauty. The music continued for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if the player had lifted her hands from the keys the moment she sensed the carriage at the gate. Sebastian's gaze fixed on the dark windows. She knew he was coming. Sebastian stepped down from the carriage before the footman could fully unfold the steps, his boots sinking slightly into gravel that had not been raked in days. The air smelled of wet stone and old leaves, and the manor up close looked worse than it had from the drive. The front steps were stained with moss, one shutter hung crooked, and the brass knocker on the door was dulled, as if no one had cared to polish it in years. A servant opened the door with the slow caution of a man approaching a wolf. He was middle-aged, thin at the shoulders, and his eyes slid over Sebastian's fine coat and crest pin with a tight, guarded look that said he already knew exactly who had arrived. "Your Grace," the servant said, but the words carried no warmth, only duty. The entry hall was dim, the air colder inside than out, and the rugs were worn in the places where generations had walked. Sebastian took in every detail the way he would assess a battlefield. The chipped plaster, the thin smell of damp, the silence that felt practiced. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked loudly, each click like an accusation. "I have come to see Miss Thorne," Sebastian said, keeping his voice even. "At once." The servant hesitated, and that single pause irritated Sebastian more than he liked to admit. "Miss Thorne is indisposed," the man answered carefully. "She asks that you make yourself comfortable in the drawing room while she decides whether to honor her own father's death with manners." Sebastian cut in. His tone stayed polite, but the edge beneath it was sharp. The servant's jaw tightened, yet he bowed and gestured down a corridor. The drawing room they led him to was large but poorly kept, its curtains faded, its furniture arranged as if someone had stopped midway through caring. A fireplace stood ready but unlit, and the cold sat in the room like a heavy hand. A portrait of Edmund Thorne hung above the mantel, a hard-eyed man with a proud mouth and a cruel calm in his gaze. Sebastian stared at it, feeling the old rage rise in him, familiar as breath. This was the face, the name, the source of 15 years of loss. He should have felt satisfaction standing under that portrait as the new owner of the house. Instead, he felt only the urge to tear it down and grind it into dust. Minutes passed, then more. No tea was offered, no apology. Servants moved quietly in and out, avoiding his eyes. Sebastian remained standing, refusing to sit, refusing to appear like a guest in a place that now belonged to him. The waiting was deliberate. He understood power plays. Edmund Thorne had used them in life. Perhaps his daughter had learned the same lessons. At last, the sound of footsteps came from the hall, light but steady, and the room seemed to tighten as if it, too, was bracing. The servant announced, "Miss Evangeline Thorne," and she entered. Sebastian had expected defiance, but he had not expected presence. She wore mourning black, simple but well-fitted, the fabric plain rather than fashionable, as though grief and shortage had both shaped her choices. Her hair was dark and pinned back in a neat twist, but few loose strands framed her face, softening the severity of her expression. She was not smiling. Her eyes, clear, watchful, met Sebastian's without flinching, and in that moment he recognized the kind of courage that didn't need loud words. She moved toward him with calm control, stopping just far enough away to keep her own space. "Your Grace," she said, giving a brief, formal dip of her head. There was respect in the title, but none in the tone. "Miss Thorne," Sebastian replied. "I see you are not indisposed after all." "I was occupied," she said. Grief does not arrange itself around a stranger's schedule. The words were quiet, but they landed with precision. Sebastian's mouth tightened. "I am no stranger to this house," he said. "Not anymore." "So I have been told," she answered, and her gaze flicked past him for the smallest second, as if she were looking through him to the future he represented. "A letter can claim many things. Land, titles, furniture." Her eyes returned to his. "But it cannot claim the truth." Sebastian felt a familiar anger stir, but something else moved beneath it. An unwanted awareness of how close she stood, how the candlelight caught the smooth line of her cheek, how her voice did not tremble even once. He pushed that thought away like a hand closing a door. "The truth," he said, "is that your father is dead, and by his own tangled affairs, Thornhill Manor is mine." Evangeline's chin lifted a fraction. "My father is dead," she repeated, and for the first time a crack appeared. Only a hairline quickly sealed, but Sebastian saw it. Pain, real and raw, hidden behind discipline. Then she steadied. "As for your claim, I am aware of what your solicitors say. I am also aware that paper is not always the full story." Sebastian took a step forward, letting his height and authority fill the space. "Your father destroyed my family," he said, each word measured. "He took my father's name and dragged it through mud. He left us ruined and shamed. My mother died because of what he did. My father followed. That is the story I have lived for 15 years, Miss Thorne, and I will not be lectured about incomplete truths by the child of the man who caused it." Evangeline did not step back. If anything, she seemed to grow stiller, as if she had chosen to plant her feet and hold the line. "You speak as though your pain grants you perfect knowledge," she said. "It does not. You were 13, were you not? You were told what happened. You accepted it, and you built a life around hating my father." Her voice remained controlled, but it sharpened. "You think that makes you righteous. It makes you determined." Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "Do not pretend Edmund Thorne was innocent," he said. "He was a gambler, a liar, a man who thought rules were for lesser people. Even now, his debts crawl out of this house like rats." Evangeline's expression flickered, and Sebastian sensed he had struck something true. Still, she held herself upright. "My father was not a saint," she said, and there was honesty in it. "He made mistakes. He made enemies. He made choices that harmed us all. But he was not the monster you want him to be." Sebastian's laugh was short and humorless. "Not a monster," he repeated. "Tell that to the Ashfords buried because of him." Evangeline's hands tightened at her sides, but she did not lose control. "And tell me," she said, "what you intend to do with me, Your Grace. Because your letter did not kill my father. Death did that. But your arrival can still kill something else." Sebastian knew what she meant. In their world, a woman's safety was fragile, made of reputation and protection, and one wrong step could break it. The thought should have pleased him, should have felt like revenge neatly delivered. Instead, it left a sour taste. "You intend to remain here," he said, "despite the law." "I intend to remain in my home," she corrected. "The only home I have left." Sebastian's patience thinned. "This is not your home," he said. "It is an estate, an asset, and now it belongs to me." Evangeline's eyes flashed. "Then you may take the walls and the roof," she said, "but you will not take my dignity along with them." Sebastian felt heat in his chest, an instinctive pull to push harder, to win, to crush the defiance in her voice. He leaned in slightly, lowering his tone. "If you make this difficult," he said, "I will remove you. The law allows it. Society will not mourn for a Thorne turned out of her father's house." The threat was real, yet as he spoke, he watched her face for fear. He found none. He found only a steady, bright anger and something like resolve. "Society already stopped mourning for us years ago," she replied. "You cannot frighten me with what has already happened." The words should have made him respect her. They did, in a way he did not want. There was a small silence, thick with unspoken things. The house's decay, the servants' listening ears, the memory of her father's face in the portrait behind him. Sebastian realized with sudden clarity that the enemy he had come to conquer was no longer alive. Edmund Thorne was in the ground. The fight standing before him wore black and had eyes that refused to lower. And worse, far worse, Sebastian felt something he had not expected, an unwanted spark of interest that had nothing to do with titles or revenge. It came from the way she stood her ground, from the clean force of her voice, from the fierce pride that made the cold room feel suddenly alive. He told himself it was only irritation. He told himself it was only the challenge. Yet when her gaze held his, he had to force his breathing to remain steady. Evangeline seemed to sense the shift too, because her expression hardened, as if she were locking a door from the inside. "You may think you have one," she said quietly, "because you have paper and power. But power does not make you right." Sebastian's jaw flexed. "And grief does not make you untouchable," he answered. "You will leave when I decide you will leave." She turned then, not in defeat, but as if she had said what she came to say and would not waste another second in his presence. Her skirts moved softly over the worn carpet as she walked toward the doorway, her back straight, her head high. At the threshold she paused without looking back. And for one heartbeat Sebastian had the strange sense that she was not retreating into darkness, but drawing around herself like armor. Then she spoke, her voice calm and cutting in equal measure. "You may own this house, your grace, but you'll never own me." And with those words, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving him standing in what should have been his moment of triumph, feeling strangely like he'd lost. Night settled over Thornhill Manor with a damp, creeping cold that seemed to seep through every crack and stone, and Sebastian found that sleep would not come. Not with the smell of decay in the halls and the echo of Evangeline Thorne's voice lingering like a challenge he could not ignore. He lay in the guest chamber for perhaps an hour, staring at the canopy above the bed as wind pressed against the windows, then finally rose, lit a single candle, and left the room with the quiet certainty of a man who refused to be a stranger in property that was now his, moving through corridors that felt too silent for a house with servants, past portraits whose eyes followed him with dull accusation, down a staircase where the banister was worn smooth by generations and now felt abandoned, until he reached the study. He remembered being mentioned in the solicitor's letter, a room behind heavy doors where Edmund Thorne had conducted business, and, if rumor was true, many sins. The lock turned, with more ease than it should have, as if even the house had stopped resisting, and Sebastian stepped into a space that smelled of old ink, smoke, and dust, the shelves crowded but uneven as though valuable volumes had been sold off, the desk scarred with age, the fireplace cold and unlit, and a scatter of papers left in disarray that told him no one here had the luxury of order. Not anymore. He set the candle down and began to read with the methodical patience of a man used to court papers and parliamentary bills. But the first shock came quickly, not in scandal, but in numbers, ledgers of accounts that did not balance, overdue payments written in tight, worried handwriting, creditors' names repeated like a drumbeat, and beside them crude notes that spoke of interest due, final notice, payment delayed again, until Sebastian's mouth tightened because he had inherited not a proud estate, but a wounded one. And the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that Thornhill was not simply neglected, but bleeding, drained by years of bad decisions. He found a list of servants' wages, and beside each name, months missing, the sums unpaid, and for a moment he pictured the cold front hall, the wary eyes, the lack of coal in the drawing room, and understood that these people had been holding a sinking ship, together with bare hands, and the anger he had brought to this place shifted, twisting into something more complicated. Disgust at Edmund Thorne, yes, but also a reluctant respect for whatever stubbornness kept the household moving at all. He opened a drawer and found correspondence from lenders in London, their language polite but sharp, mentioning gaming debts, promissory notes, a gentleman's honor that had been exhausted, and Sebastian felt his jaw clench because it fit the picture the world had painted of Thorne, The proud gambler who would wager the roof if it meant he could feel superior for one more night. He should have felt pleased that the man had died with ruin as his companion. But the satisfaction would not settle, because Evangeline's defiance now had context. She was not guarding wealth. She was guarding ashes. Then, as he searched deeper, he found something that made the candlelight seem to flare. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, shoved behind a row of books as if hidden in haste, the paper brown with age, the handwriting on the top envelope familiar enough to make his throat tighten, James Ashford's hand, his father's sharp slant, the very same style Sebastian had seen in a few old family papers kept in a locked drawer at Ravencross. And for a moment he simply stood there, stunned, because he had not expected to find any trace of his father in this enemy's house. He untied the ribbon with fingers that were steady by force of habit, and the first letter he unfolded carried the scent of time and smoke, beginning not with hatred, but with a name written like an old friend, Edmund. It read, and Sebastian's pulse beat hard as he scanned the lines, seeing references to our partnership in India, to shipments, accounts, promises made in ports whose names Sebastian could barely pronounce, and then, buried among the business phrases, words that carried a different weight. The betrayal. What really happened? You know I never meant for it to end this way, until Sebastian's breath grew shallow because this was not the story he had been given. Not at all. He read another letter, then another, his mind struggling to fit them into his understanding of the past, and each page made the shape of the true stranger. His father sounded anxious, even guilty at times, and Edmund Thorne, at least in James's words, had once been trusted, once been close enough to warrant affection. And Sebastian felt something like vertigo because the hatred he had held for 15 years had always rested on the belief that Edmund Thorne was an outsider who struck the Ashfords from a distance. But these letters suggested something far more intimate, a friendship turned sour, a wound inflicted from within. He searched for the letters that might explain the turning point. The moment betrayal became ruin. But the bundle broke off too soon, and when he examined the desk again, he noticed faint marks where a compartment might have been, and he realized with cold certainty that important papers had been removed, not lost by accident, but taken deliberately, as if someone in this house knew the value of what was hidden here and had chosen to protect it, or to bury it forever. Anger rose again, sharp and clear this time, because someone was keeping him from answers, and he did not like being controlled, not by the dead and certainly not by the living, and his thoughts returned, unwillingly, to Evangeline, to her calm certainty when she said a letter could not claim the truth, to the way she had looked at him as if she saw the cracks in the story he carried. He was still standing over the desk, candle guttering low, when a faint sound drifted in from the corridor. Soft footsteps, careful, not the heavy tread of man, and Sebastian's instincts tightened, because a house at night revealed its secrets only to those who listened. He moved silently to the door, opened it just enough to see a sliver of the hall, and watched as a figure crossed near the stairwell, holding a lantern low, the light catching on the edge of black fabric. And even before he saw her face, he knew it was Evangeline, because she moved like someone trying not to wake the house, as if she carried responsibility instead of fear. Sebastian followed at a distance, not for amusement, but because this was his estate now and he would know what happened in it. And Evangeline led the way down another set of steps toward the servants' wing, into a part of the manor where the air smelled of soap and boiled water rather than old polish. And there, in a small kitchen with plain tables and hanging copper pots, she set her lantern down and went straight to a woman lying on a narrow bed near the hearth, an older housekeeper with gray hair and a lined face, breathing shallowly beneath a blanket. Evangeline knelt beside her, checking her forehead with gentle hand, murmuring words Sebastian could not fully hear but could understand by tone alone. And then she spooned a bit of broth to the woman's lips with careful patience, the kind of patience that came from necessity, not leisure. Sebastian paused in the doorway, unseen, feeling an unexpected pull of discomfort, because this was not the behavior of a spoiled heiress guarding her pride. This was the behavior of someone holding a household together by sheer will. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, and she whispered something, and Evangeline bent close, her shoulders sagging for first time, her exhaustion visible now that she believed herself alone, and Sebastian realized she looked too thin beneath her mourning gown. Her cheekbones sharpened in fashion with demand, and when she stood and turned, she froze because her gaze landed on him in the doorway, and in the quiet kitchen, the distance between them felt suddenly intimate in a way the drawing room had not allowed. "You shouldn't be wandering," she said, the words firm but not loud, as if she feared waking the sleeping woman more than she feared him. "And you shouldn't be hiding documents," Sebastian answered, stepping in and letting the candlelight from his hand meet the lantern's glow. Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of alarm too, quick and suppressed. "I have hidden nothing," she said, though her tone carried the same careful control he had heard earlier. "Your father's letters were in the study," he replied. "And something is missing." Evangeline's chin lifted, but for a second her gaze dropped toward the sleeping housekeeper, as if she measured every word against a fragile peace in that room. "This is not the place for arguments," she said quietly. "Then tell me why the servants haven't been paid," Sebastian said, the ledgers heavy in his mind. "Tell me why this house is freezing while the Thorne crest hangs above the fireplace like a mockery." Evangeline's mouth tightened, and her eyes flashed with something close to shame before pride covered it. "Because my father gambled," she said, the admission forced out as if it tasted bitter. "Because he borrowed too much and thought luck would save him. Because when he began to lose, he lied to everyone, including himself. And because the debts did not die with him." She looked at the older woman again. "Mrs. Blackwood has served this house for 30 years. She deserves warmth. She deserves food. She deserves to be paid." Sebastian had no answer for that, not one that satisfied him, because his hatred had always been aimed at Edmund Thorne, not at the innocent people who suffered under his roof, and he disliked the way this truth tugged at his sense of justice, complicating what he wanted to keep simple. Evangeline picked up a cloth, wiped her hands, and when she faced him again, her eyes were bright with sleeplessness and something like fear that she would never admit. "So," she said, voice low, "you've come to enjoy the ruins." Sebastian held her gaze. "I came to claim what's mine," he said, "and to learn what your father stole." A brief silence followed, and in it Sebastian heard the housekeeper's faint breath and the far-off groan of the manor settling. Evangeline's shoulders rose and fell in a careful inhale. "Do you hate him enough?" she asked, and the question was so direct it felt like a blade slipped between ribs. "To punish me too?" Sebastian's throat tightened, and for the first time since he received a letter in London, he could not summon a clean, certain response. He had hated Edmund Thorne, yes, with a fury so steady it had become part of him, but standing here in a servant's kitchen, looking at a young woman who carried grief and responsibility like weights on her back, he could not tell himself she deserved the same punishment. He said nothing, and the silence stretched, heavy with what he refused to admit. Evangeline's expression hardened as if his lack of an answer confirmed her worst expectations, and she stepped past him, lifting her lantern, moving toward the corridor with the controlled pace of someone refusing to let tears win. At the doorway, she paused only long enough to glance back once, not pleading, not angry, but simply tired, and then she was gone, her black gown vanishing into the dark hall. Sebastian remained in the kitchen, candle burning lower, the smell of broth and soap mixing with the dust of old papers in his mind, and as he listened to housekeeper's quiet breathing, something twisted in his chest, something that felt dangerously like doubt. Morning came gray and heavy, a mist curling over the fields like breath on glass, and Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ravencross, sat in the late Lord Thorne's study once more, his hands flat on the desk that had belonged to his enemy. The night's discoveries had not left him. He had read and reread his father's letters until the candle burned to the socket, each word gnawing at the certainty he had carried for half his life. But questions could wait. He still had to establish control. The estate was lawfully his, and Evangeline Thorne remained an obstacle that needed resolving. The sound of soft footsteps in the hall reached him, and when the door opened, she entered with that same steady composure that made every servant in the house seem smaller in her presence. Her morning dress was unchanged, but her eyes were darker from lack of sleep. "You wish to see me?" she said, her tone not quite a question. "Yes," Sebastian answered. "Sit, if you please." She did not move toward the chair until he added, "This is not a request." Her chin lifted slightly, but she sat, hands clasped in her lap. Sebastian drew a folded sheet of paper toward him. "You and I have unfinished business," he said. "By law, this estate now falls under my title. By circumstance, you still occupy it. That cannot continue indefinitely. Her gaze did not waver. Then remove me, she said quietly. You have the power. Yes, he replied, but I prefer reason to spectacle. You're not a trespasser, Miss Thorne. You're an inconvenience, and one that can be managed. A flicker of irony crossed her face. I am flattered to be promoted from trespasser to inconvenience. He ignored it. I've decided you may remain at Thornhill temporarily, on conditions. That startled her. You mean to let me stay? Until the estate is settled. There are documents your father left in chaos. Financial papers, correspondence, accounts I cannot make sense of without assistance from someone who knew his habits. You will organize them, catalog everything in this room. In return, you may stay until the work is complete. She frowned, suspicion shadowing her features. So I become your clerk? Your servant. You can call it employment if that pleases you, he said. I call it practical. You know this house. You know where things are hidden. And I have no patience for guessing games. Her silence stretched, the tick of the mantel clock marking the pause. Then carefully she asked, And what happens when the work is done? You leave, Sebastian said simply, with what is yours, with my word that I will not drag your father's name through public ruin, unless I find proof that demands it. Her breath caught slightly, the first sign that the offer reached her. You think I would agree to such terms without any voice of my own? She asked, but there was less fire now, more calculation. You're free to refuse, Sebastian said, and I'm free to enforce the eviction papers waiting in York. Evangeline studied him for a long moment, then said, If I am to accept, I have conditions too. Sebastian's brow arched. You are in no position to bargain. Perhaps not, she said evenly, but you are in need of cooperation, and I will not give it blindly. She counted on her fingers with quiet precision. First, the servants' day. All of them. You will pay what my father owed them. I will not assist you in tearing apart the only home they have left. Sebastian hesitated, the demand irritatingly moral. Some of them are unnecessary. All of them, she repeated. You are rich, your grace. They are not. Surely your revenge can afford compassion. The challenge in her voice was deliberate, and it worked. He hated the idea of seeming small. Very well, he said. They stay. For now. She nodded once. Second, I have free access to the library. I will not live in this house like a prisoner. You'll have no need for books to catalog ledgers, he said, but when she gave him a look that was both weary and proud, he added, Fine. The library remains open to you. Third, she said softly, you will hear my side of the story before you destroy what's left of my father's name. That one he rejected instantly. No, he said, I'm not here for tales meant to paint guilt in softer colors. You're afraid of being wrong, she said quietly, and the words hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, forcing a calm he didn't feel. 2 conditions, he said. The third is refused. Evangeline's eyes searched his, but when she saw he would not bend, she drew in a slow breath and said, Then we have an arrangement. He gestured to the paper on the desk, a short contract his solicitor had drafted that morning, already bearing his signature. Read it. Sign it. Then we begin. She read carefully, her lips moving faintly as she followed each line, and when she reached the end, she took the pen he offered. Their fingers brushed. It was nothing, a momentary touch, but the reaction it sparked in him was instant and unwanted. A flash of awareness, the warmth of her skin through thin gloves, the quiet steadiness of her hand. He looked away before she noticed, but her breath hitched almost imperceptibly as she signed her name, Evangeline Thorne, the ink looping strong and sure. When she set down the pen, the silence between them was charged with something new and dangerous. It's done, she said, rising from her chair. Yes, Sebastian answered, standing as well. We are now bound together by ink and necessity. Her mouth curved in something too sharp to be a smile. Strange fate, she murmured. Enemies under one roof. He studied her a moment longer, then said, You will begin with the study this afternoon. My steward will handle the servant's pay. She inclined her head, then turned to leave, but paused with her hand on the doorknob. "The servants are already talking," she said without looking back. "They wonder how long before one of us kills the other." Sebastian gave a dry, humorless laugh. "They underestimate us both." She glanced over her shoulder then, her dark eyes catching the light. "Or perhaps they understand us too well." And with that, she left the room, skirts whispering against the floor, the faint scent of lavender following her like a memory. Sebastian stood alone again, staring at her signature beside his. The contract was simple on paper. She would stay. She would work. And when the truth of Thornhill was laid bare, she would go. But as he looked at the name Evangeline Thorne written beside his own, he felt the uneasy sense that something larger had just begun, something neither law nor logic could contain. He could already hear the servants whispering down the halls, predicting what he refused to imagine, that this strange alliance between the Duke and his enemy's daughter would end in either murder or marriage. And though he would have laughed at such gossip a day ago now, as the morning light crept across the desk and caught on the ring he wore, a relic of the family honor, he thought he understood. Sebastian found himself unable to decide which outcome terrified him more. 3 days passed in a pattern that felt simple on the surface and tense underneath, as if Thornhill Manor itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which of them would break first. And Sebastian quickly learned that sharing a house with Evangeline Thorne was not like hosting a guest or managing a servant, because she neither pleaded nor bowed. And she carried herself through the halls as if the contract on his desk had not changed the fact that she still considered Thornhill her home. Each morning began the same way, with a silent breakfast in a dining room too large for 2 people, the long table making their distance feel deliberate, a fire that burned only because Sebastian ordered it, and servants who moved as quietly as ghosts, their eyes darting between the Duke and the last Thorne with the careful watchfulness of people listening for thunder. Sebastian took his tea strong and plain, and he noticed, without meaning to, that Evangeline took hers without sugar and drank it, slowly as if each sip mattered. And the detail told him more than any speech could have, because even in morning black, she could not hide the quiet signs of shortage. A gown that was clean but mended at the sleeve, a thinness at her wrists, the way she cut bread with neat precision, as if wasting a crumb were unthinkable. After breakfast they separated like opposing armies under a flag of truce. Sebastian to the estate ledgers and letters he had demanded from York, Evangeline to the study with, piles of her father's papers, and the house filled with the sounds of work. The scrape of chairs, the soft rustle of pages, the distant clink of pots in the kitchen, and sometimes, from behind a closed door, the quick scratch of her pen as she catalogued each document with stubborn discipline. He told himself he should be pleased to see her occupied, contained, but instead he found his attention drawn to the smallest things he caught by chance. A strand of hair escaping her pins when she bent over a box of letters, the ink smudge at the edge of her finger, the way her brows tightened when she read something that troubled her, and the fact that she never asked for help even when the stacks of papers threatened to topple. Their conversations during the day were mostly business, sharp and clipped, because neither of them wanted to soften, yet even those exchanges carried sparks, the kind that came from 2 wills pressing hard against each other. She corrected him when he made assumptions about the estate, telling him which fields flooded in spring, which tenant families were honest, which roofs would collapse if he delayed repairs. And he found it irritating, then surprising, then oddly compelling, because she spoke with the knowledge of someone who had been forced to pay attention, not the careless confidence of a pampered daughter. And when he questioned her, she answered with facts, not excuses. Once, as he reviewed an account book, he muttered that the northern tenants were likely lazy, and she looked up from her work with a cool, steady stare and said, "They are not lazy, Your Grace. They are hungry," and the quiet certainty in her voice made him feel, for a brief uncomfortable moment, like the foolish one. He pushed back by challenging her on politics, mentioning Parliament and the cost of reforms, expecting her to retreat into the polite ignorant society often demanded of women, but she met him word for word, arguing that power without responsibility was rot, that landlords who squeezed the poor would one day face consequences, and Sebastian, who was used to being agreed with or flattered, found himself both angered and impressed, because her reasoning was sharp, her language plain, and her eyes held the fearless light of someone who had nothing left to lose. The trouble was that the more they spoke, the harder it became to keep her as a symbol of his enemy rather than a living person with her own mind, and that shift unsettled him in ways he refused to name. The house itself seemed determined to force them together, because their paths crossed again and again, in narrow corridors and at blind corners, their shoulders brushing, their hands reaching for the same door handle, their bodies pausing a fraction too long before stepping aside. Each encounter accompanied by a quick exchange that sounded like irritation, but carried something else underneath. Once he turned a corner near the library and nearly collided with her, and she grabbed his sleeve to steady herself, her fingers firm and warm, and for a heartbeat he stood too still, feeling the contact, like a shock. Then she released him as it burned and said, "Watch where you're going," while he answered, "In my own house?" And the words should have been ordinary, but the air between them felt charged, as if both of them heard what they were not saying. The servants noticed, too, in their quiet way, and Mrs. Blackwood, now strong enough to sit by the fire wrapped in a shawl, watched them with pale, knowing eyes whenever Sebastian passed through the servants' hall, as if she had seen men like him before and understood that hatred could be a thin mask for other emotions. By the third night, Thornhill's routine had settled into a tense normal, but Sebastian's sleep had not improved. Because the manor groaned in the wind, his mind refused to rest, and once, near midnight, he walked to the library, intending only to find a book that might dull his thoughts, only to discover Evangeline there alone, seated on a low chair near the shelf with a small candle burning beside her, a book open on her lap, her shoulders trembling slightly. She did not see him at first, and in that private moment her composure fell away, revealing quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks without sound, and Sebastian stopped in the doorway, uncertain, because he had not come prepared to witness her grief. The book in her hands looked worn, its spine cracked with use, and when she wiped her face quickly, as if ashamed of being caught, he stepped forward to spite himself and asked, more roughly than he intended, "What is it?" She swallowed and held the book tighter. "My mother's," she said, her voice small for the first time. She used to read it aloud when the house was different. The simple sentence carried a whole history of loss, and Sebastian found, to his own surprise, that he did not want to press her, did not want to turn this into another battle. He reached into his coat, pulled out a handkerchief, and offered it in an awkward, silent gesture, unsure how to be anything other than hard. Evangeline stared at it as if it were a foreign object, then took it with careful fingers, not touching his hand this time, and whispered, "Thank you." So quietly it almost vanished into the library's shadows. The tenderness lasted only a moment, because she straightened, wiped her face, and the walls returned to her expression like a door closing, and when she rose with the book clutched to her chest, she said, "You should go to bed, Your Grace. Tomorrow will not be kinder." And he answered, "Nor will I," but the words sounded weaker than he liked. She walked past him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of lavender again, and as she left the library, Sebastian realized something that made his stomach tighten with real fear. He was beginning to care what she thought him, and caring for Thorne was the one thing he had sworn, at 13 years old beside his mother's grave, he would never do. The following afternoon, sunlight filtered weakly through Thornhill's tall windows, casting pale bars of light across the dusty floor of the study, where Evangeline worked alone. She had been sorting through her father's scattered papers for hours, bills, deeds, and letters that smelled faintly of smoke and ink, when the drawer of his old desk jammed beneath her hand. She tugged once, then again, harder, until it gave with a reluctant groan. Inside lay a shallow compartment lined in green felt, but when she tapped its bottom, it sounded hollow. A spark of instinct or memory made her press along the edge until her fingertip found a hidden latch. With a soft click, the false bottom lifted. Beneath it rested a bundle of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon, the paper brittle with age. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the first page and recognized the handwriting, her father's, but the salutation made her still completely. "My dear James." James Ashford, Sebastian's father. She read quickly, each word drawing her deeper into a truth neither man had ever told. The letters began with warmth and friendship. Two young men united by ambition, business, and affection. They had been partners, almost brothers, investing together in a trading venture in India that promised fortune. Yet as the letters went on, the tone darkened. There were mentions of a woman, Amara, of jealousy and guilt, of the child we must protect, and the debt of honor that cannot be repaid. Then, abruptly, the letters ended with one torn mid-sentence, as if interrupted by disaster. Evangeline sat frozen, the papers trembling in her hands. Her father and Sebastian's had not been enemies from the start. They had been bound by something far deeper and far more dangerous. For long, while she could not move, her mind racing with questions she had no one to ask. If she showed these letters to Sebastian, would he even listen? Or would he see them as another lie from a Thorne? She pressed the papers against her chest, whispering to the empty room. "What did you do, Father?" The thought of her father's shame still pained her, but the idea that he might have once loved and been betrayed, that he might have been trying to protect a secret instead of hide a crime, ignited a small, fragile hope. As the light faded, she decided to keep the discovery to herself. At least for now, she needed to understand the truth before handing it to a man who would use it as a weapon. Yet her secrecy did not go unnoticed. That evening, while the servants cleared the supper table, Sebastian observed her from across the room. Something in her manner had changed. Her eyes flickered with private thoughts, her replies shorter, her hands never far from the pockets of her gown, where she had hidden the key to the desk. He could not name what it was, fear, guilt, or defiance, but he felt in his gut that she was hiding something. Later, as the house sank into silence, he found her again in the corridor outside the library, a book in her hand, her candle held close to her face. "You've been busy," he said, stepping out of the shadows. She stopped, startled, then steadied herself. "Cataloging is agreed," she replied. "You watch me too closely for a man who trusts his own authority." "And you avoid my questions too neatly for a woman with nothing to hide," he countered, moving closer until the flickering light from her candle reached his face. Her breath caught, but she didn't retreat. "What are you hiding, Evangeline?" he asked, voice low, almost gentle, but the intensity in it made her shiver. She lifted her chin. "I owe you no explanation beyond the contract we signed." "That's where you're wrong," he said, stepping nearer. His hand braced against the wall beside her shoulder, not to frighten her, but to stop her from slipping away. "Every secret in this house concerns me now. Every debt, every letter, every lie. You think everything can be owned," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Even truth." He stared at her for a long moment, his pulse unsteady, the nearness of her blurring the line between anger and something he could not afford to feel. "Tell me," he said again, softer this time. She hesitated, and for a second he thought she might. Then her lashes dropped, and she whispered, "You wouldn't believe me." She tried to step past him, but he didn't move, and the sudden closeness sent a shock through them both. Her breath quickened, his jaw clenched, the air between them thick with tension neither could name. For a heartbeat they stood like that, silence heavy as thunder. Then, almost without meaning to, his gaze dropped to her lips, and hers lifted toward his, drawn by something reckless and human. The space between them vanished, until reason returned like a blow. She gasped softly and pulled away, clutching the book to her chest, retreating down the hall before he could stop her. Sebastian stood motionless, listening to the echo of her footsteps fading into darkness. He pressed a hand to his chest, furious with himself for the weakness that had nearly undone him. He was supposed to be planning revenge, not losing sleep over his enemy's daughter. But when he returned to his room, sleep refused to come. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the look in her eyes, the warmth of her breath, the curve of her voice when she said his name. Somewhere between hatred and desire, something inside him was shifting, and that frightened him more than any ghost of the past ever could. The letter arrived at breakfast, delivered on a silver tray as if it were an ordinary note and not a summons that could shake the ground beneath them, and Sebastian knew the seal before he read it, the kind used by men who expected obedience. So he opened it with a calm he did not feel and found a short, urgent message calling him back to London for Parliament, citing a vote and a committee session that could not be delayed. And for a moment he stared at the words with irritation, because Yorkshire had begun to feel like a place where answers might finally be uncovered, yet duty had a way of dragging even dukes by the collar. When he looked up, Evangeline sat across the long table, her face composed, her hands folded neatly, but her eyes had that guarded brightness he had come to recognize as her warning that she was thinking too much and saying too little. "Business?" she asked, as if it were nothing. "Parliament," Sebastian answered. "I leave today." Her fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. "How long?" "1 week," he said. He expected relief from her, perhaps satisfaction at his absence. But what he saw instead was something like calculation, as if she were measuring what a week without him might allow. That annoyed him, and it also stirred a faint unease, because he did not trust what she might do with freedom, not because he thought her wicked, but because he suspected she was desperate. He pushed his chair back and rose. "We will speak in the study," he said, and she followed with steady steps, refusing to look like she was being ordered even when she was. Inside the study, he closed the door and kept his voice clipped. "My steward, Mr. Grimsby, will oversee the house in my absence. The servants will continue to be paid. The contract stands." Evangeline's expression remained calm. "I can read, Your Grace," she said. "Then read this clearly," Sebastian replied, the edge returning. "Do not attempt to leave Thornhill while I am gone." Her eyes narrowed. "You think I would run?" "I think you have secrets," he said, and watched her flinch almost imperceptibly. "And I think you are clever enough to believe you can outpace me." Evangeline's voice cooled. "This is my home," she said. "I couldn't leave if I wanted to." The words should have reassured him, yet something in the way she said them, flat, bitter, made him think of cages, not comfort. He studied her for a moment, then added more quietly, "Do not create trouble that forces me to act harshly." Evangeline's gaze lifted fully to his. "Harshly," she repeated, and the faint curve of her mouth was not a smile. "Is that what you call it when you break people because you can?" The accusation hit close enough to sting, and Sebastian felt anger flare, but beneath it was a reluctant awareness that he had, in fact, already broken her reputation by bringing her under his roof, whether he meant to or not. He turned away before she could read his face, gathered his gloves, and ended the conversation the way he ended most things, by refusing to give it room to deepen. Within the hour, his carriage rolled out of Thornhill's gates, the house shrinking behind him into mist and bare trees, and he told himself he felt only relief to return to the order of London, where rules were clear and enemies wore known faces. Yet as the countryside gave way to busier roads and then to the soot-stained edges of the city, he found his mind slipping back to Thornhill against his will, to Evangeline's stubborn posture and the heat of that almost kiss in the corridor, and he hated himself for the distraction. London met him with noise and motion. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, vendors calling, the thick smell of coal smoke, and the familiar weight of expectation. At his townhouse, he changed into proper attire and went straight into the world that required him. Clubs, offices, and the long, echoing halls where men debated the nation's future as if it were a chess game. That evening at White's, his closest friend, Lord Marcus Pemberton, found him with glass untouched in his hand and an expression too sharp to be natural. "You've been gone from London like a man fleeing creditors," Marcus said, dropping into the chair beside him. "Yorkshire must be either very dull or very interesting." Sebastian answered, "I inherited an estate." Marcus raised a brow. "And the estate has you looking like you've swallowed a blade." Sebastian hesitated, then made the smallest admission he had made in years. "There's a woman," he said, as if the words were distasteful. Marcus's eyes brightened with immediate suspicion. "A woman," he repeated, "in Yorkshire." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "Do not enjoy this." Marcus leaned in slightly, lowering his voice with the easy intimacy of friendship. "Is she dangerous?" "She is a thorn," Sebastian said. Marcus's amusement faded into something more serious. "Then she is dangerous," he replied, "not because she is wicked, but because you are not thinking clearly. You don't hate her father, Ashford. You hate the story you were raised on, and stories can be overturned." Sebastian bristled. "You know nothing about it." "I know you," Marcus said calmly, "and I know that when a man begins to sound uncertain, it is usually because someone has reached a part of him he kept locked." Sebastian looked away, displeased by how close the truth felt. Meanwhile, far from London's gaslit streets, Evangeline moved through Thornhill with a purpose she did not allow herself to question. Sebastian's absence did not soften the house. It only made the air feel less watched, and in that quiet space her courage gathered strength. She returned to the hidden letters, reading them again with shaking hands, and one name repeated like a signpost. A solicitor in London, near Lincoln's Inn Fields, mentioned in a half-finished line about provisions made should the truth ever be needed. Evangeline's heartbeat pounded as she realized her father had left a trail that led directly into the city Sebastian now occupied, and as she waited, the trail might be erased forever. She told herself it was foolish for a young woman to travel alone, unchaperoned, with her reputation already hanging by a thread, but she also knew that waiting was another form of surrender, and she had surrendered enough. She packed a small bag at dawn, hid the letters under her cloak, and told Mrs. Blackwood she was going to visit a distant cousin in York, a lie that tasted bitter but necessary, then hired a carriage with what little money she could gather, her hand steady even as her stomach knotted with fear. As the horses pulled her away from Thornhill, Evangeline pressed the hidden letters to her chest like armor and stared out at the road ahead, knowing she was about to uncover a truth that could either save her father's name or destroy what was left of it. What she did not know, what fate had arranged with cruel precision, was that Sebastian Ashford was in the same city, moving through the same streets under the same winter sky, and their paths were about to collide in a way neither of them could control. London hit Evangeline like a wave of noise and smoke, all clattering wheels and calling voices. And by the time her hired carriage reached Lincoln's Inn Fields, her hands were numb inside her gloves, not from cold alone, but from the fear of what she might learn. Because a woman traveling without protection was already a story people wanted to repeat, and Evangeline could feel eyes on her even before she stepped down. She kept her chin high, gave the driver his coin, and walked into the solicitor's office with the controlled pace of someone who refused to look uncertain, though her heart thudded hard as a fist against the door. The clerk, who greeted her stare a moment too long at her mourning dress and her lack of escort, then asked her name as if it were a test. "Miss Evangeline Thorne," she said, and the clerk's expression shifted, recognition flickering like a match catching flame. He disappeared behind a door, returned with a thin gentleman whose gray hair and careful manners suggested he had spent his life handling other people's secrets. "Miss Thorne," the solicitor said, voice smooth, "we were not expecting you in person." "I was not expecting the need to come," Evangeline answered, "but I have reason to believe my father left matters unresolved." The solicitor studied her, then gestured her into a small office lined with shelves and ledgers. "Please," he said, "sit." Evangeline remained standing. "Tell me what you know," she said. A faint sigh left him, as if he had hoped for more time. He opened a drawer, drew out a packet of documents, and laid them on the desk. "Your father established a trust fund in your name," he said, "some years ago." Evangeline blinked, stunned by the words. "A trust," she repeated. The idea almost ridiculous, because Thornhill was crumbling and the servants had gone unpaid. "Yes," he said, "it is substantial." Her stomach tightened. If her father had money hidden away while the house suffered, what did that make him? A coward? A liar? But before anger could take shape, the solicitor added, "It was protected, kept out of reach of creditors, intended for your security." Evangeline's breath caught. For a heartbeat, her grief shifted into something like warmth, because she could almost see her father in the act, flawed, desperate, yet trying, in his own broken way, to leave her something. Then the solicitor cleared his throat and slid a second page forward. "There's a condition," he said carefully, watching her face. Evangeline's eyes narrowed. "What condition?" The solicitor's voice remained professional, but his words landed like stones. "You may access the trust only upon marriage, Miss Thorne, and only with the approval of the trustee named in the document." Evangeline felt heat flood her cheeks, humiliation rising fast. "Marriage," she echoed, "as if I were property to be transferred." "It is not uncommon," the solicitor said quickly, as if trying to soften the insult. "Your father wished to ensure you were protected by a husband of suitable standing." Evangeline's fingers curled into her palm. "And who is the trustee?" The solicitor hesitated, then turned the page so she could read the name written in firm, legal script: Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ravencross. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Evangeline stared, unable to draw a breath. The Duke, the man who had walked into her home like a conqueror, the man who spoke of law like it was a weapon, the man who watched her too closely and demanded answers he did not deserve. Trustee, control, money tied to marriage. Her mind snapped into a single furious thought. He knew. He must have known. He had kept her trapped, not only by the roof over her head, but by the purse strings around her throat. Evangeline's vision blurred, and she grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. "This is a lie," she said, voice low and shaking. "It is not," the solicitor replied, clearly alarmed by her sudden pallor. "It is properly witnessed and filed." Evangeline did not wait to hear more. She snatched her letters, turned, and walked out of the office with a speed that was almost a run, pushing past the clerk, past the curious stare of another client in the waiting room, out into the street where the winter air hit her like a slap. She felt exposed, as if the words on that paper were pinned to her back for all of London to read. She moved without direction at first, simply putting distance between herself and that desk, that name, that proof of control. Carriages rattled past. Men called out. Women in bright bonnets glanced at her with open curiosity, their attention lingering, because a woman alone in morning black was always interesting. Evangeline turned into a broader avenue, then into the openness of Hyde Park, desperate for space, desperate to breathe, but the city did not loosen its grip. Her anger rose like fire, burning through fear, until it was all she could hold on to. And then, as if fate enjoyed cruelty, she saw him. Sebastian Ashford stood near the path, speaking to another gentleman, his posture effortless, his coat perfectly cut, the kind of man who belonged in London the way she never could. Evangeline stopped so sharply a passerby nearly collided with her. Sebastian turned at the movement, and his gaze landed on her. For a split second, surprise crossed his face, real, unguarded. Then his expression hardened into suspicion as he excused himself and strode toward her. "Miss Thorne," he said, voice tight, "what are you doing here?" The question might have sounded reasonable in a private room. In Hyde Park, with people strolling and pausing and looking, it sounded like ownership. Evangeline's fury snapped into words. "You knew," she said. "You knew all along." Sebastian frowned. "Knew what?" "My money," she spat, stepping closer. "My father's trust. The condition. The marriage. You control my life from the start, haven't you? You've held my future in your hand while you pretended this was only about an estate." Heads turned. A woman slowed her walk. A man with a cane stopped as if he had discovered free theater. Sebastian's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Lower your voice," he said sharply. "I will not," Evangeline answered, voice rising despite herself. "Not when you've made a fool of me." Sebastian's jaw clenched. "I knew nothing of any trust," he said, and there was a clear note of shock in his tone, as if the accusation had hit him in the chest. Evangeline's anger faltered for a fraction of a second. Only a fraction, because the surprise looked genuine. But pride would not allow her to step back now. "Do not lie," she said. "Your name is on the document. Duke of Ravencross. Trustee." Sebastian took a step closer, eyes sharp, voice low with urgency. "Show me," he demanded. "Now." Evangeline's hands shook as she pulled the folded paper from her cloak. Sebastian snatched it, scanned it, and went still, his face draining of color. For one heartbeat, the arrogant Duke vanished, replaced by a man confronted by a truth he did not expect. He looked up at her. "I swear to you," he said, voice rough, "I did not know." But it was too late for oaths. Too late for quiet. People were openly watching now, whispers spreading in quick, excited threads. The Duke and a young woman in mourning, arguing like lovers or enemies, close enough for scandal either way. Evangeline felt the weight of those eyes, and a cold realization slid under her anger. In London, perception was reality, and they were writing her story right now. By evening, the gossip would be everywhere, at clubs, at dinner tables, in drawing rooms, twisted into something uglier. The Duke had lured Thorne's daughter living unchaperoned at his estate. The Duke had trapped her. The Duke had compromised her. As the murmurs thickened around them, Sebastian stared at the document in his hand, then at Evangeline's pale, furious face, and something changed in his expression, not triumph but dread, because he finally understood the true damage his revenge had done. In his quest to punish her father, he had destroyed her, and the worst part was that he could not bear the thought of losing her now. Sebastian did not offer Evangeline the courtesy of choice once the whispers began to gather like crows. He folded the trust document with a tight, controlled motion, tucked it into his coat, and said, "We are leaving," in a tone that brooked no argument, then took her elbow, not roughly, but firmly enough that any onlooker would read it as possession, and guided her toward the nearest carriage stand before the crowd could grow into something worse. And Evangeline, burning with humiliation and fury, resisted at first with stiff shoulders and sharp breaths, but even she understood that standing in Hyde Park to continue the scene would only feed London's appetite. Inside the carriage, the door shut with a heavy thud, cutting off the city's noise, yet the silence that followed was not peace but pressure, thick with everything they had said and everything they had not. Evangeline sat rigidly on the opposite seat, hands clenched in her lap, staring at the window as if she could will London to vanish behind the glass. Sebastian sat across from her, posture straight, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the document as though he could force it to rewrite itself. When the horses began to move, the carriage rocking over cobblestones, Evangeline finally spoke, her voice low and hard. "You have ruined me," she said. Sebastian's gaze lifted. "I know," he answered, and the bluntness of it surprised her more than denial would have. She swallowed, anger shaking at the edges into something more vulnerable. "Do you truly mean you didn't know?" she asked. "Because if you are lying, Your Grace, I will hate you in a way you cannot imagine." Sebastian's eyes held hers steadily. "I did not know," he said. "If I had, I would have addressed it immediately. I would not have allowed a solicitor's office to be the first place you learned such thing." Evangeline's lips pressed together, and she reached into her cloak to pull out her own copy of the solicitor's statements, thrusting it toward him. "Read it again," she said. "Read what your name means on those pages." Sebastian took it, read in silence as the carriage rolled beyond the city's edge, and with each line his expression tightened, not with triumph but with discomfort that edged into something like shame. "This is extraordinary," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "My steward in London handles most family trusts. If my name was used—" "Used?" Evangeline echoed bitterly. "Like I was used." Sebastian's fingers tightened on the paper. "You are not a thing," he said sharply, then caught himself as if surprised he cared enough to insist. A long stretch of road followed with only the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Outside the window, London's buildings gave way to open fields and winter-bare trees. And with the distance, Evangeline's fury began to shift into exhaustion. She had come to London desperate for answers, and had found a new cage instead. At last she spoke again, quieter. "My father was flawed," she said, eyes still turned toward the countryside. "He made mistakes that hurt all of us. He gambled. He lied. He let Thornhill decay. But he was not cruel to me." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, and she steadied herself. "He tried, in the only ways he knew, to protect me. That trust was his attempt. He thought marriage would keep me safe." Sebastian listened, and something in his face softened just a fraction, because he could not reconcile this tired, honest grief with the monster he had built in his mind. "My father never tried to protect me," he said suddenly, the admission rough. "Not from the disgrace he brought us. Not from the whispers. He withdrew. He left me with anger and silence." Evangeline turned then, her eyes sharper, searching. "You said Lord Thorne destroyed your family," she said. "But you were a child. How do you know what truly happened?" The question landed like a blow, because it went straight to the crack that had begun in Sebastian's certainty. He stared down at his gloved hands. "I don't," he admitted, each word forced. "I know what I was told. I know what I saw afterward. I know my mother died of grief. I know my father drank himself into the ground. And I know everyone said Edmund Thorne was to blame." Evangeline's voice softened against her will. "Everyone says many things," she replied, "especially when a story is easier than the truth." Sebastian's throat tightened, and he looked away, as if the landscape could spare him from what he was beginning to understand, that he had been operating on inherited hatred, a legacy of pain that no one had ever properly explained to a 13-year-old boy. The carriage jolted suddenly as a wheel hit a rut, and Evangeline, already tired and tense, was thrown sideways with a small gasp, her body tipping forward. Sebastian reacted without thought, reaching out and catching her, his arm bracing around her back as she fell into his chest. For an instant they were tangled together, close enough that her breath warmed his collar, and his heartbeat thudded hard against her ribs. Evangeline froze, one hand pressed against his coat, her hair loosening slightly from its pins. Sebastian held her too long, and when their eyes met, the world outside the carriage seemed to fade into nothing. "We shouldn't," Evangeline whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Sebastian breathed, and yet he did not release her. All the anger, the confusion, the humiliation of the park, the ache of old grief, and the new, dangerous pull between them fused into a single reckless moment. He leaned in, and she did not turn away. Their kiss was not gentle. It was desperate and angry and hungry, as if both of them were trying to claim something they'd been denied for too long. Control, comfort, certainty, anything. Evangeline's fingers tightened in his coat. Sebastian's hand slid to her jaw, holding her as if she might vanish. Then reason returned like cold water. Evangeline pulled back first, eyes wide, breath unsteady, and Sebastian released her as it burned, his face hardening even as his pulse refused to calm. She moved back to her side of the carriage, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands, staring at the floor as though it might swallow the moment whole. Sebastian looked out the window, jaw clenched, furious at himself, and yet the taste of her lingered like a truth he could not deny. The rest of the journey passed in charged silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the carriage and the distant cry of a bird over the moors. And when Thornhill Manor finally appeared again under the dull winter sky, Sebastian felt a cold clarity settle over him. Everything had changed. He could no longer pretend this was only about revenge. This was about Evangeline. And God help him, he was falling in love with the one woman he should never want. They returned to Thornhill Manor under a low, troubled sky, and the house looked as if it had aged another year in the few days they had been gone. Yet the real weight waiting inside was not the damp stone or the unpaid debts, but the scandal that had already raced ahead of them on faster horses than their own. The moment Sebastian stepped to the front doors, a servant approached with a stack of letters on a tray, each envelope marked with bold handwriting and the sharp scent of judgment. And Sebastian did not need to open them to understand. London had spoken, and Yorkshire was listening. Evangeline stood beside him in the entry hall, her face pale with exhaustion, her posture rigid as if she were holding herself together by will alone. And when she glanced at the letters, Sebastian saw the flicker of fear she tried to hide. He read quickly in the study, scanning phrases that repeated in different forms. Impropriety, disgrace, reckless, unchaperoned, living under the Duke's roof. And then the worst line, written with polite cruelty by a distant aunt. Miss Thorne is ruined. He set the letter down slowly, feeling an unfamiliar knot of anger, not at Evangeline, but at the ease with which society destroyed women, while men survived with little more than bruised pride. A soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Blackwood entered, leaning on a cane but steady, her eyes alert and severe. She did not pretend respect. She had served this house too long to be impressed by titles. "Your Grace," she said, then looked to Evangeline with a gentler gaze. "Miss Evangeline." Evangeline's chin lifted. "Mrs. Blackwood," she replied. The older woman's mouth tightened, and she turned back to Sebastian. "There is only one remedy now," she said plainly. "You must marry her." The word struck the room like a thrown stone. Evangeline's head snapped toward her. "No," she said, sharp as a slap. "Do not speak as if I am a broken object that can be repaired with vows." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes softened, but her voice did not. "I speak as the world speaks, miss," she answered, cruelly and without mercy. "If you do not marry, you will have no place to go. And this house will be swallowed by creditors within a month." Evangeline's gaze flashed to Sebastian, and he felt the sting of her suspicion. "So that is it," she said, voice low and shaking. "You will marry me to keep your estate tidy, to put a ribbon on the scandal you started." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I did not start. You brought me to London," she cut in. "You pulled me through Hyde Park like I was already yours. You argued with me in public. And then you look shocked that people believe the worst." Her voice rose with each sentence, fed by humiliation and fear. "I would rather die than marry you from obligation. The words landed hard, and for a moment Sebastian had no clean answer, because part of him wanted to deny obligation entirely, to admit the truth that had been haunting him since the carriage. He wanted her, and that desire frightened him, but another part of him knew the practical facts were closing around them like iron. Before he could speak, a commotion sounded in the front hall, and minutes later Lord Marcus Pemberton entered the study with traveled dust on his coat and urgency in his eyes. He bowed to Sebastian, then looked at Evangeline with a brief, careful respect. "I came as quickly as I could," Marcus said. "It's worse than you think." Sebastian stiffened. "Explain." Marcus glanced toward the letters, then back to Sebastian. "Your political enemies are using the story," he said. "They're saying you keep a young woman under your roof in Yorkshire and then chase her through London like a possession. They're calling you reckless, unfit, hypocritical. They're aiming to damage your influence in Parliament." Sebastian's hands curled slightly at his sides. He could take attacks aimed at him. He had endured worse. But the thought of Evangeline being crushed as a byproduct of his war with other men made something harden in his chest. Evangeline let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. "So I am a weapon after all," she said quietly. "A scandal to be used." Marcus's expression tightened with discomfort, as if he wanted to argue but could not. Sebastian looked at Evangeline and saw, beneath her anger, the reality. She had nowhere safe to go. Society would not forgive her. The trust fund was locked behind marriage and trustee approval. If she left Thornhill now, she would be devoured by rumor and poverty. And if she stayed without marriage, every day would deepen the disgrace until no respectable door would open to her again. Sebastian drew in a slow breath, forcing himself into a decision that felt both ruthless and necessary. "Enough," he said, and the authority in his voice quieted the room. He turned to Evangeline. "I am offering a marriage of convenience," he said. "Not romance, not obedience. A legal shield." Evangeline's eyes narrowed. "A cage," she replied. "A shield," he repeated firmly. "You will have my name, my protection, and access to your trust. The gossip will die when it has nothing new to feed on. And when the proper time is past, when it is safe, you may live as you choose. Independence, space, whatever terms can be arranged." Evangeline stared at him as if trying to find the trick. "And what do you get?" she demanded. Sebastian's voice remained steady, but his honesty cost him. "I salvage both our reputations," he said. "I keep the estate from collapsing into public ruin. And I end this scandal before it becomes a weapon that destroys us." Evangeline's hands trembled, and she hid them by clasping them together. "So I must marry you to survive," she said, the words stripped bare. Sebastian's gaze held hers. "You must marry someone," he answered. "And if it is not me, it will be a stranger who demands far more than I ever will." Silence filled the study. Even Marcus looked away, as if witnessing something too private. Evangeline swallowed, her throat working, her eyes bright with contained emotion. "Fine," she said at last, the word sounding like surrender and steel at once. Then she lifted her chin. "But I want the truth first." Sebastian's brow furrowed. "What truth?" "About our fathers," she said, and the intensity in her voice sharpened the air. "About India, about the betrayal, about the missing documents. I will not marry into a lie that poisons everything." Sebastian felt his chest tighten, because he wanted the truth too, perhaps now more than he wanted revenge. "You'll help me find it?" she pressed. He nodded once. "Yes," he said, "we will find it together." Evangeline held his gaze a moment longer, then extended her hand as if sealing a business deal, not a life. Sebastian hesitated only a second before taking it, and the contact sent a brief, unwelcome pulse through him. He released her hand and reached into a small case on the desk, where he kept a ring he never expected to offer. His mother's ring, a simple band set with a pale stone that caught the weak light. "Then we are agreed," he said quietly, and slipped it onto her finger. Evangeline went very still as the ring settled into place, as if she could feel history closing around her. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke, and Sebastian realized with strange, frightening clarity that this engagement was not merely a solution. It was a bond, a door that closed behind them both. They were engaged to survive a scandal and solve a mystery, but as Evangeline looked down at the ring and then back up at him, her expression caught between resentment and something softer she refused to name, Sebastian felt the real mystery tightening in his chest. What they were becoming to each other. The days that followed their engagement were marked by a strange, quiet intensity, the kind that comes not from peace but from concentration. For Sebastian and Evangeline now worked side by side in Thornhill's study like two detectives bound by duty rather than affection. Yet with every hour that passed, the wall between them thinned. They searched through ledgers, journals, and correspondence with a precision that bordered on obsession, determined to uncover the truth buried beneath 15. Years of lies. Piles of old papers filled the room. Records from India, shipping logs, and private letters yellowed with age, and as they pieced the fragments together, a story began to take shape, not of villainy and innocence, but of two men undone by pride and love. It began in 1830, when James Ashford and Edmund Thorne, young and ambitious, left England for Calcutta to build a trading partnership. The venture prospered beyond expectation, but both men fell in love with the same woman, Amara, the daughter of a respected merchant. She was intelligent, beautiful, and brave enough to speak her mind, and it was Amara who drew the invisible line that would divide their friendship forever. The letters revealed that she chose James, though he was already promised to a lady in England, Sebastian's mother. When she discovered her pregnancy, James panicked, torn between duty and passion, and left India, abandoning Amara and the child she carried. Edmund remained behind, trying to protect what James had forsaken, and when Amara died giving birth, he raised the boy as his ward, using funds from the partnership to secure the child's education and future. But James, ashamed and fearful of exposure, accused Edmund of theft from across the sea, destroying his name to silence the truth. Sebastian read the confession in his father's own handwriting, found in a letter never sent but preserved in a box marked to be burned. The words were stark, remorseful, impossible to deny. I wronged him. Edmund, the brother I chose. I took his honor to protect my own. If there is justice, let it fall upon me, not my son. The paper trembled slightly in Sebastian's hand, and Evangeline watched his color drain from his face, the anger that had sustained him for years dissolving into something raw, grief, disbelief, and guilt. He set the letter down carefully, as though afraid it might vanish, and for the first time in his adult life, the foundation of who he was cracked completely. It was my father, he said hoarsely. He was a traitor. Edmund Thorne, your father, was innocent. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears that were not victory but sorrow, because this truth did not mend what had been broken. It only revealed how much needless pain had been endured by both families. She knelt beside him, her hand hesitating before resting lightly on his shoulder. We are both the children of their choices, she said softly, but we don't have to repeat them. He looked up at her then, and for a long moment, the study seemed to disappear, the ghosts, the past, the noise of wind outside, until all that remained was her face, steady and compassionate in the glow of lamplight. I've hated you for nothing, he whispered, and she shook her head. You hated what you were told to hate, she said. Now you can choose something else. He reached for her hand, not as a duke claiming property, but as a man seeking solace. And when she did not pull away, their fingers laced together naturally, almost with relief. She smiled faintly through tears, and when he leaned forward, their lips met, not out of passion alone, but out of recognition. Two souls who had been twisted apart by the lies of others finally finding truth between them. The kiss was tender, unhurried, the kind that sealed more than a promise. When they parted, neither spoke for a long while, and the silence was peaceful at last. Yet the peace did not last, because neither noticed a figure standing in the shadowed doorway, a man with traveled dust on his coat, and a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of both the Ashford and Thorne bloodlines. He watched them quietly, his expression unreadable, then stepped back into the hall. His voice, when it came, was calm and certain, carrying just enough to reach them. I believe, he said, you're both looking for me. And in that instant, the fragile calm they had built shattered again, for the truth they thought they had uncovered was only half the story, and the man who had completed had just arrived. Sebastian and Evangeline turned as one, the air in the study tightening, and in the doorway stood a man of about 32 with traveled dust on his boots and a doctor's worn satchel slung over one shoulder, his posture calm yet cautious, as if he walked into a room full of loaded pistols. His face was striking in a quiet way. Dark hair like Sebastian's, the same strong line of jaw, but with softer eyes that looked more accustomed to listening than commanding. And when Sebastian rose slowly from his chair, the letter still lying open on the desk between them like a confession, the stranger took one step forward and spoke again, voice steady and plain. "My name is Alexander Ashford," he said. "I believe I am your half-brother, your Grace." For a moment Sebastian could not move, because the words were impossible, and yet they fit too cleanly with everything they had just read. Evangeline's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide, and Sebastian's chest felt as if it had been struck. "That's not possible," Sebastian managed, though his voice lacked conviction. Alexander's gaze did not flinch. "It is," he replied. "I was born in India. My mother was Amara." The name landed like a bell in a silent church, and Sebastian's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to Alexander, as if hoping to find a lie in his face. "You," Sebastian began, then stopped, because there were no proper words for what he felt. Shock, grief, shame, and something like awe that the past could step into a room wearing a living man's features. Alexander took off his hat, holding it with careful respect. "I did not come to claim your title," he said. "I came because Edmund Thorne is dead, and because the secret he kept is now unprotected. I feared someone would twist it into scandal." Evangeline's voice came out first, soft and trembling. "My father knew you?" Alexander turned to her, and his expression warmed with genuine gratitude. "He raised me," he said. "Not as a servant, not as a burden. As a ward, yes, but also as a son in many ways. He taught me to read, pushed me to study. He paid for my schooling in Scotland. He never spoke of himself as a victim, even when he had reason, and he never spoke ill of James Ashford." Sebastian swallowed hard. "He never spoke ill of my father," he repeated, the words almost choking him. Alexander shook his head. "He said your father had obligations," he answered. "He said men make cowardly choices when they're afraid. He believed hate would only rot what was left of the life." Evangeline's eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together, fighting emotion. Sebastian felt a hot sting behind his own eyes and hated himself for it, because he had spent years building a fortress of pride, and now it was cracking in front of a stranger who shared his blood. "Why come now?" Sebastian asked, voice rough. Alexander's gaze dropped briefly. "Because the trust," he said. "Because I heard the Duke of Ravencross had taken Thornhill. Because I feared Miss Thorne would be harmed by the old story." He looked at Evangeline with quiet seriousness. "I'm sorry I did not come sooner. I stayed away because Edmund asked me to. He wanted you protected from the truth, Miss Thorne, and you protected from scandal, your Grace. He believed silence was safer." Sebastian let out a bitter breath. "Silence killed my mother," he said, "and it made me cruel." He turned to Evangeline, and the words that followed came from a place in him he did not often reveal. "I used my power against you," he said, "not with my hands, but with my position, my anger, my certainty. My father's sins became mine because I carried them forward." Evangeline stared at him, the ring on her finger catching lamplight, and for a moment Sebastian feared she would agree with the harshest version of him, the one he now saw too clearly. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice controlled but warm. "We cannot undo what they did," she said, "but we can choose differently." Alexander watched them with something like relief, as if the outcome he hoped for was unfolding. Sebastian drew in a slow breath, then made the decision that frightened him most because it required surrender rather than control. He faced Evangeline fully. "You are free," he said, and his voice did not waver. "The engagement was born of scandal and necessity. I will not trap you in a loveless marriage. If you wish to leave Thornhill, you may. I will arrange a safe household, a suitable companion, whatever you need. The trust will be handled properly. I will sign what is required. You owe me nothing." For a heartbeat, Evangeline did not speak. Then she lifted her chin, and her eyes shone with a fierce softness. "What if I don't want to be free?" she asked quietly. Sebastian's breath caught. "Evangeline, what if I want to marry you?" she continued, the words steady now. not from obligation, not because society demands it, but because I choose you." The room went very still. Alexander turned away slightly, as if granting them privacy without leaving. Sebastian stared at Evangeline as though he had never truly seen her until this moment, and then with a slow, deliberate movement, he sank to one knee. There was no performance in it, no polished charm meant for drawing rooms, only honesty. "I came for revenge," he said, voice low. "Instead, I found the truth, and I found my brother, and I found the one person who could pull me out of the man my anger made. I love you, Evangeline. Will you marry me?" Evangeline's breast shook, and tears slid free at last. "I've loved you since you burst into my home," she whispered, and then more firmly, "Yes." Sebastian rose and took her hands, pressing a kiss to her fingers with a tenderness that felt new and hard-won. And when he looked at Alexander, his voice broke slightly. "Brother," he said, as if trying the words for the first time. Alexander gave a small nod, eyes bright. "Sebastian," he answered, simple and sure. The wedding took place a short time later in Thornhill's small chapel, not grand, not crowded, but intimate and real. Mrs. Blackwood in the front pew dabbing her eyes, the servant standing with quiet pride, Marcus present as witness and friend, and Alexander beside Evangeline as she walked the aisle, not as a stranger but as family, giving her away with steady hand. When Sebastian placed a ring on her finger, the vow he spoke was not about ownership or duty, but about choosing love over vengeance, and the house that had once been a battleground seemed, for the first time in years, to breathe easier. 2 years later, in the Manor's renewed library, sunlight fell across repaired shelves and new drapes, and Evangeline sat by the window with her little daughter, Amara, laughing softly as the child banged a wooden block against a book, while Sebastian stood behind his wife with one hand resting gently on her shoulder and the other holding a letter he had begun for their future children, a promise written in plain words about the danger of inherited hatred and the strength of forgiveness. Alexander, now a familiar presence, read by the fire with medical journal beside him, part of the household as naturally as if it always belonged, and outside the windows the gardens bloomed again. The estate renamed Thornhill Ravencross as a public sign that 2 broken legacies have been joined and healed. "I claimed an estate," Sebastian whispered, leaning down to kiss Evangeline softly, "and found everything I never knew I needed." "You claimed my heart," Evangeline replied, smiling to the kind of peace that once seemed impossible, "and saved us both." Outside, the Thornhill Ravencross gardens flourished with new life, proof that even from the ruins of hatred, love could grow. And in the library where their story had truly begun, surrounded by their child and the brother they had found, Sebastian and Evangeline built what their fathers never could, a legacy of forgiveness, redemption, and love that would last for generations. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We are truly grateful for your presence and your time. If this story of revenge transformed into redemption moved you, we warmly invite you to support our channel by subscribing, liking the video, leaving a comment, and sharing it with others who might enjoy tales of enemies becoming lovers and love conquering inherited hatred. Your support helps us continue bringing you heartfelt stories. At the end of this video, another story from our channel will appear. Click and let yourself be drawn into another unforgettable journey. Thank you once again.